Yes. A lot of people think that athletes are exempt from a lot of things, but we're not exempt from the things that go on daily in our country. So we felt that, it was necessary for us to kind of come together and bring about change. A lot of guys were doing a lot of work individually, but coming together has allowed us to make a larger impact in our country, especially when we're talking about locally, which is why we're here today. One of the people that I wanted to bring up was Arameus, our state attorney, if she's here. There she is. And for her, I would like to have a conversation with her. Number one, about, the job of a state's attorney. I think a lot of people don't understand what that job entails. I ask a lot of people a lot of times, do you know, number one, do you know who your DA or your state attorneys is? And a lot of people can't tell you. And they obviously can't tell you what that job entails. So I think it's important, especially when we start to talk about local elections and things like that, to know who you're voting for. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people who vote for people who they don't know. They vote for people who they don't know the policies that they stand behind. Unfortunately, they vote for people who they see names on the side of the road. And I think that's not the way it should be. I think we should be educated on who we're voting for, the title that they hold, and the job description that comes behind that. So we would definitely like to get the conversation started today. And hopefully here in Orange County, people will be a lot more informed about what's going on, the issues that we have here, and come up with solutions to fix those issues.
Good evening, everyone. Aramis Ayala, the state attorney for this community, and I want to thank you all for coming out. I took this job back in 2017, and so many things have happened. So many things haven't happened. And some of the problems that I've attempted to address remain open wounds. Some of the problems that I saw, I've implemented policies to address them. And one of the things that I've talked about for a very long time is the disconnect between law enforcement agencies and the communities that we serve. Whether we like the idea of it or not, there is a huge disconnect. And we can blame whomever we want for it, but it's not about the blame, it's about the responsibility. And the responsibility lies on every single person who is involved in it. So if we're going to address it, I want to be real about some things. So I have an opportunity to talk to Anquan Boldin, who I want to thank you for your service, thank you for your commitment, and most importantly, from the day that I met you, thank you for your sincerity to this issue and bringing it to our community. Back in 2015, your family suffered a horrible loss, very painful and tragic, when your cousin was shot and killed while he waited on the roadside, waiting for safety. Can you talk us through a little bit about what happened so that we can acquaint, some people may be familiar with it, but if you can let us know, talk about that a little bit for us.
Yes. My cousin Corey Jones he was gunned down by a plainclothes police officer. I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with what happened, but in Palm Beach Gardens, my cousin was on his way home. He was a drummer in a band, and he was on his way home from a gig that he played that night. And unfortunately, he ended up breaking down on the side of the road. And while he was on the phone with roadside assistance, a police officer pulled up, but he didn't know the guy was an officer. The guy was dressed in plain clothes, t-shirt, jeans, baseball cap, and he pulls up He was in a white van. He pulls up on the wrong way on the ramp. So my cousin is parked this way on the side. The guy comes up the wrong way of the ramp, and he parks in front of my cousin. And he gets out and says, "Can I help you?" And my cousin says, "Oh, I'm good. I'm on the phone with roadside assistance. They're gonna send help, so I'm good. Thanks." And then he was like, "Really?" My cousin was like, "Yeah, I'm good. They sending help." And he goes, "Really?" sarcastically one more time. And my cousin was like, "Man, I just said." And the next thing you hear is, "Wait, don't shoot." And there's 3 shots. Bow, bow, bow. And there's a pause, and then there's 3 more shots. And the only saving grace, I think, was that the entire call was recorded. The officer didn't know that it was recorded. But once they played it back, you can hear the operator. After the first 3 shots, she was like, "Oh my God, he shot him." And then there's a silence, and then 3 more shots go off. And for my family, that was something difficult, because for anybody who's ever known Corey, know he's far from confrontational. I believe had the officer acknowledged himself as an officer, he could have gotten Corey to do anything that he wanted him to do. And it's unfortunate because, it happened. And for 3.5 years, there was, I don't know, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether justice would be served. I think one of the things that really was crazy was the guy was apparently on house arrest, but was able to work a normal job. He had different privileges, and it was almost like a slap in my family's face. Like, I mean, you have a guy who's murdered somebody, but he's walking the streets daily. He's able to hold a job. He's able to provide for his family. He's able to go to his daughter's dance recitals. He's able to do all of these things. And here we are grieving, never to see a loved one again. And it's not because of anything that he did wrong. It's just because this guy was careless and very unprofessional. But, going through that ordeal, it taught us a lot. I think one of the things that what was crazy to me, even after we received the justice that we felt like we deserved, to learn that was the first officer convicted on an on-duty shooting in the last 30 years was unbelievable to me.
So I want to talk about that for a second. You mentioned your family receiving the justice that it deserved, or what you all saw. If you were to ask each person out here today what justice looked like, there may be a difference in that. So from the position of family, what did justice look like? What did you see as the end result in that scenario?
Yeah, I think for us, justice was that officer being held accountable. Like you said, I mean, for a lot of people, justice looks different. Some people want to get revenge, and that's just a true reaction. There's a lot of emotions that go on when something like that happens. But for us, it was important for us to maintain some level of civility. We just wanted to be civil in that moment, show people, I guess, how to get through it. Yeah. That's something that you don't wish on your worst enemy. And for us, just having that officer held accountable, I guess was justice.
So you said it was about a 3-year period. Was that motion, stand your ground? Like, tell us a little bit about what that process was like. And this is after the burial, after the funeral, after the estate passing and things of that nature.
Yeah, it was it was a lot, because there's so many times where you're going to court just to see if the guy would be tried. I mean, him, invoking stand your ground when, and I mean, I don't mean to, I don't know. There's just I think there's a lot of privileges afforded to police officers to the point where stand your ground is just like overkill. I mean,
Well, and that's what I'm hoping that we're able to talk about a little bit later on tonight, because a lot of people have different feelings about stand your ground. There's different reactions, and a lot of people don't completely understand the concept of stand your ground. And if I can just touch on it just a little bit. When we hear in this community talk about stand your ground, the first thing that everyone talks about is George Zimmerman killing Trayvon Martin. That's the first thing that we think about. And then you'll hear some, legal eagles say that, well, that wasn't a stand your ground case. And then everyone talks about the jury instruction that said he had a right to stand his ground. The only difference in a stand your ground case is that they get what we call an immunity hearing. They get the judge to determine whether or not he or she should be not found guilty or not liable based upon that, and that didn't happen after Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin. So when you talk about that process, talk about the hearings that you went to, that the inconvenience and what that did for your family as a victim of this type of crime.
Yeah, so I felt like it was a trial before the trial, but it was also like my cousin was being tried.
Talk about that. I want to go a little bit into his physical appearance, the dynamics of the encounter, his education, and how you said he, as a human being, was put on trial for this.
Yeah, so just going through that whole stand your ground period, it's almost like he had to be the perfect person in order for stand your ground not to be invoked. So his hairdo was brought up. I mean, my cousin had dreads, so that was a strike against him. I mean, they bring up everything. If you smoke, they'll bring that up. If you drink, they'll bring that. I mean, there's so many things that it seems like they bring up to try to discredit the person who got killed. They try to make him out to be something that he isn't. God forbid if you have a criminal background, that is definitely going to be brought up. So it's all of these things that are brought up to try to justify the killing. And like I said, fortunately for us, my cousin had his past was clean. So I felt like that kind of helped, but I couldn't even imagine if, he had been in jail for, I don't know, whatever.
So
that definitely, I felt like that would have been used against him in his own death.
And during that, 3-year period, what was different to you about the dynamics of that trial? Because we're here today talking about relationships between the police and the community and holding people accountable. Did you believe that he may not be held accountable because it was a black male victim, or did you believe that he wasn't going to be held accountable because the aggressor was a police officer?
Both.
Okay, explain that.
I mean, I don't think it's any secret that if it's a black guy that's getting killed, I mean, 9 times out of 10, he's not getting the benefit of the doubt. But on the flip side, if it's an officer that did the killing, he has a lot of backing. I mean, for me, it was tough going through it because I've worked a lot with the local sheriff's department.
In what capacity?
Through my foundation. I've done a lot of events with them. I've promoted a lot of things on behalf of the sheriff's department. And always tried to cast them in a good light because I feel like that's a very important job to have. And I've always felt like that relationship with the community should be a good one for both sides. I can remember, growing up in Pahokee, having law enforcement were some of our baseball coaches. So that relationship to me was very important. I think we've gotten away from that a little bit for whatever reason, but I've always felt like that relationship was important. But going to court and seeing my family on one side and law enforcement on another side, and it's like people that I've worked with can't even look me in my eye.
So let's segue into coming a little bit closer to the next part of the conversation. You've talked a little bit or a lot about your experience, and I can assure you, whether it's from the law enforcement side or from community member side, if we go through each person, they have a scenario that they can either relate on one side or the other. And one of the most unproductive things that we do is leave it at an incident and make that speak for everyone, but we cannot get away that it has importance. So if you can explain your presence here today, your openness to talk about that and what that means in this setting for a community who is faced with issues and trust issues, community issues, safety for both the community and law enforcement. Why is that relevant, and how do we get to the next step when it comes to holding people accountable, when it comes to our elected officials, when it comes to leaders in the community? Why is this important?
So for me, I think it's very important. Like you said, a lot of times we only see things one way. But I think you have to, especially coming into a conversation like this, you have to have an open mind. There's no way that we can paint all law enforcement with a broad brush.
Right.
Just like I would hate for people to paint athletes with a broad brush. Like, all athletes aren't the same. All athletes don't think the same. They don't have the same experiences. They don't come from the same backgrounds, whatever. Same when it comes to law enforcement. You'll see people try to paint law enforcement with this broad brush, but actually I have family members who are law enforcement, and seeing them go through the trial, like, I can't even imagine, what they were going through, having to work with people that see things a different way than they do, especially when it comes to, one of their loved ones being killed. I'm here today because I think this is a conversation that has to happen. Like, I think for far too long we've avoided this conversation as a nation. And I think by avoiding that conversation, we're in a position that we're in today, where there's no trust.
What do you think the part of the conversation that is so difficult? Because when we're honest and we have very transparent conversations, there are racial dynamics that go along with how we see. You talk about your cousin with the dreads. We talk about, the identification and the reaction to a person, them being 6 feet, a dark male, and things of that nature, that it has a different reaction. And when you respond to police shootings, for example, our standard in the law is whether or not it was reasonable for the police officer to discharge his or her firearm. And if that reasonableness can be justified because of the threat that a person appears because of their physical appearance, then we run into some of those issues. So what are some of the other difficult parts of the conversation that we shy away from, that we want to make certain we tackle here this evening?
Well, I think one of the difficult parts of having an honest, open conversation is it make you check yourself. Like, you actually have to take an in-depth look at you.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that people don't want to do. It's easy for people to kind of point the blame somewhere else. But when you force people to look at themselves, for a lot of people, that's scary. And I think that's something that we all have to do. We all have to look at our hearts first, you know what I'm saying, and see what kind of biases that we do have. And you ask somebody, are they biased, or do they have biases, or whatever it is? Most people tell you no. Right. But deep down inside, we all do. So I think that's the scary part about having this conversation, is it makes people reflect on who they are, their beliefs, how they view people, the biases that they do have, And I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with that.
Well, and also we have this issue where when we admit our bias, we're put in a position that makes us a bad person, and we try to hide and cover that, which doesn't expose us and put us in the best light. But the bottom line, if we belong to a community in whatever capacity, we are all responsible for this issue that we have. And if we continue to discuss more and have continuous conversation about fault finding, versus responsibility and individual responsibility to identify it, I think we're going to continue up this road of being frustrated, of, being angry, and most importantly, people continuing to be killed. So,
my question, so as a state's attorney, how do you deal with laws like this that are on the books?
It's challenging. I look forward to a very deep conversation. Don't think we have the specific date in October, but I was faced with a situation that I think was very public, where there was an indictment on a police officer that later I had to make a decision to drop the case. And the law didn't change in between the time that I indicted and the time that I dropped the case. But the circumstances, the appearance, the realities, the impact, the appellate stages, all of the truths, and then the divisiveness that still may end up with an acquittal, I had to weigh some things. So I think that it's very important for us to understand that the law as written now does not benefit those who are being shot and killed in the street by someone in law enforcement. That's my position, and it's difficult to deal with. So when we constantly lean on the law versus the pursuit of justice, then we're going to constantly have this issue. The law only requires a level of malice to be present, as well as a reasonableness to the person who is discharging the firearm. And if you can paint, as you talked about, Corey, if you can paint a ugly picture of someone who is in the middle of a crime, who has a physical appearance that was justified, when you look at our juries, when you look at the law, we're going to end up in this situation. So until we have not just me and two others, but until we have a force of people who are willing to challenge the injustice in a way that begins to change this and keeps us all safe, because I think what we forget to talk about is that the safety issue is not just for us, right? The community people, the people in the community. It's not just us who are in danger. It puts law enforcement as danger as well, because of the reaction to the injustice endangers everyone. And then it continues to heighten, and no one is safe. So if we're really interested in public safety, we have to be true, we have to be honest, and that's one of the things. So your question of how do I deal with it? I don't shy away from the realities that the law does not allow for a simple resolution to someone being shot and killed in the street. Like, they go on trial. And I can't change that. I don't sit on the court, but I can call attention to it from a position to say that as an attorney, as someone who has practiced law in a position, that it does not equal the level of justice that I would like to see for the community. So if you want to go ahead. She's saying that she's collecting cards. Okay. I don't want to make
Hello. I think I like your mic better. Yeah. How y'all doing? Good? No? Okay. Got a couple of questions here, and we're collecting the rest. Oh. Should I wait for the questions or read the ones I got? Okay, I got a question here. It says, please discuss how stand your ground has played out differently for white people versus people of color? Do we have two sets of laws in America? Lastly, what can people of color do to feel safe?
So every study states to have stand your ground, that it is more likely for a black person who asserts stand your ground not to get it in opposition of people who are not of color. They're granted that opportunity. So the numbers speak for itself, and all the data that supports it, that race, it does have a negative racial impact, and imbalance between those. Now, what can black people do to feel safe? I think that there's so many things that we have to be honest about. Why aren't we feeling safe? So I don't think that we can say, how do we feel safe, unless we understand, is it because, that there are gunshots in the middle of the night from random people? Is it because there's crime on the corner that we're living in? Is it because, we've been a part of something? Or is it because we've been constantly threatened and harassed in the communities in which we live, and everyone's turning a blind eye to it? And the discussion here of turning a blind eye to it, I think that it's more important for us to have people in positions who are not going to turn a blind eye to injustice and not just lean on one person. There's a lot of pressure for one or two or three people to make the change, but in order to feel safe, we have to have conversations and call it out and believe that our voice does have some power behind it.
Thank you. Okay, for those of you who don't know me, let me introduce myself. I just started talking on the mic. I got a mic and just talk. I'm Bo Outlaw, the community ambassador for the Orlando Magic. So the questions I'm asking are representing the community. So y'all got that understood there, okay? Not my questions, but the community's questions. I'm not saying it in Spanish. I don't know if y'all will get all that. Okay, secondly, in stand your ground, does it interpret differently when used by a police officer or when used by a civilian? How are cops and civilians perceived differently by judges and jurors? And should they be perceived differently? Or do they come out of court at an even position?
So the statute that outlines stand your ground it has no different standard for police officers. There's, under the law, they have a right to assert stand your ground. So that's the starting point, is that there is no distinction between the use of it. They're entitled to their immunity hearings, they're entitled to a trial, they're entitled to call witnesses, they're entitled to the entire process doesn't change because it's a police officer. The most recent case law, obviously, is that they're entitled to it. But when it comes to how people interpret and understand it, there's absolutely a difference. Because when you look at, like, for example, one of my daughters is floating around here, not literally floating, but so if you were to look at a 6-year-old little girl who has a stuffed animal in her hand, there's a level of threat that she does not represent. Versus if you were to see a 6'5" black male with his hand in his pocket, there's something that we have agreed with an unspoken agreement that means something. There could be a threat. And because of that, we have, whether it's through the media, whether it's through what we actually see and experience, whether it's the over-policing in certain areas, there is a different reaction because it seems reasonable that some people will respond in certain ways, and there's a possibility that that person, because of their demographic, because of what they look like, will pull out a firearm. And that is what makes the response and the discharge defending themselves more reasonable to juries and to people who may interpret it.
Okay, fair. So, next question. How do you build trust with little kids as they grow up into adulthood? Like for example, little 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, little kids that are running around. How do you build trust?
You that one, Anquan.
Oh, that really wasn't for Anquan. It's just how you build trust between the kids that are growing up, because as a kid, they see the law enforcement as they see in the parents and all these, they see the same stories we see. How do you build that trust amongst them so as they get older, they feel safe enough to communicate with the law enforcement?
Yeah, I think it goes back to just law enforcement being a part of the community. I think anytime you can have a personal relationship with someone, you're less apt to see them in a different light. And I go back to, like I said, when I was growing up, we had a police department, and all of the officers, they knew everybody in the community. They lived in the community. They were our coaches. Yes. They knew your mom and your grandma, and like if you did anything, as opposed to them trying to put you in the system so quickly, they would take you home. You know what I'm saying? Look, I know Miss So-and-so. You know what I'm saying? I'm taking you home. I'm gonna let your grandma or your mom deal with you, whatever. But now, unfortunately, where I'm from, we lost that police department, and now it's ran by the county, the sheriffs. So they're no longer a part of that community. They're no longer coaches in that community. They're no longer your next door neighbor. They no longer know your grandmother. So that relationship is completely different as to where they would have taken you home back in the day. Now they're locking you up.
You know, I was going to say, I think we also have to remember that how people are treated in front of their kids matters as well, right? You know, if a kid calls law enforcement because they feel in danger because mom is being beat up by dad, and then dad's taken in, and then mom has something on her and she ends up going to jail, or like it trickles down. So part of it is consistency. If we're going to tell like kids that they're safe and that, you know, these are good guys and they're helpful, then they can't see me not receiving that level of respect. At the end of the day, respect is free. Like, we can all be safe. Like, respect never compromises safety. I've never seen a scenario where respect compromised safety. So I think trust is something that does come from respect.
I agree. I definitely agree.
One more community question. I got you. I got one. What is the difference between police presence and police harassment in the community? I don't know who this would be for. I don't know if you want to answer this one. Can you answer that?
I'm not a police.
I know. I need a police officer. You want to answer that question? Well, come on. See, I'm inviting people up from the crowd. I'm going to give you the mic.
The difference between police presence and police harassment is the presence of a police officer in the neighborhood as community policing. Talking to the kids, like you said, either playing sports or visiting the schools and talking about saying no to drugs, no to guns. That's police presence. Police harassment is what we sometimes see on TV, is a young black male walking down the street, minding his own business, and two police officers coming up to him and questioning him and stopping him where he's going, and he hasn't committed a crime. No crime has been committed. And they ask him for his ID, and he refuses to give his ID. And then he walks across the street because he can't get by on the sidewalk. So he's forced across the street, and then what do? They arrest him for jaywalking. That's police harassment. That's the difference.
Okay. Oh, okay. So with that being said, you want me to tell my next guest to come up? That guy right there? Mr. Stan Van Gundy. A lot of y'all might know him, but I know him very well. So Mr. Stan Van Gundy, come on, y'all. Thank you. That's what y'all do. I clap for him. You need all our seats? Oh, so we got to go. He said we got to go. That's pretty much what he said. Hey, he said it in a nice way. Now y'all clap for us.
I think I can. Okay, I want to get right to our panelists because that's who you want to hear from tonight, certainly not from me. So we'll start with Deborah Barra. She's the Chief Assistant to State Attorney for the 9th Judicial District and running for the State Attorney's seat. Probably you two here, yeah, thank you. We also have Ryan Williams, also running for the state attorney's seat, where he previously was the trial unit director, and now he serves in Lake County's state's attorney's office. Thank you. We have John Mina, who's the Orange County Sheriff and previously was the Chief of Police for the City of Orlando. Andrew Darling, an Assistant Orange County Public Defender who is running for the Orange County Sheriff's Office. And Joe Lopez, a longtime law enforcement veteran who's now the Senior Manager of Security for Walt Disney World, and we've already heard from him once. So I think we'll go to all of you on this one. They've asked me to have you try to keep your answers to about a minute. I don't know that I'll be much of an enforcer up here, but between Anquan, Bo, and Quentin, we probably could enforce it pretty well. So we'll try to keep it short. We'll just start on this one with all of you and go down the line. We'll start, I guess, with you, Ms. Barra. Do you feel this lack of trust between police and people in low-income communities and communities of color? And if so, why do you think this lack of trust exists?
The answer is yes. I do think that there is a distrust between low-income communities and law enforcement. I think it exists for various reasons. I think one is the perception of law enforcement and the ways and manners in which law enforcement have treated members of the public, where I do believe that there is a sense of, stories get passed down from one generation to another generation, and people grow up with that in their mind as they see cops. And I know that my reality, in terms of what my perspective is very different than a lot of people's perspective. When being white, if I jaywalk, and I jaywalk every day, Monday through Friday. I cross the courthouse to go to Dunkin' Donuts. I do it every day. And sometimes there's officers there, and they will say, "Good morning." And I will say good morning back to them, and it never occurs to me that at some point I would be stopped and frisked, or have a consensual encounter where they ask me what I'm doing or anything like that, because that is not my reality, and it's never going to be. But I think the first step is recognizing it's not my reality, but that reality still exists. And once you identify that, you understand that, then you can start working on the problem. And I think that it goes both ways. It's not just a law enforcement issue, it's a community issue. Not all law enforcement is bad, but when law enforcement does act bad, they need to be held accountable. You have to call it for what it is.
Yes, I think it exists. From my perspective, prosecuting cases, I see the lack of trust most often when it comes to actually testifying about what happens. I think the biggest problem that I see in particular areas of color are crimes occur, and I prosecuted a case once where there was a shooting in the middle of a field with about 400 people, and 2 witnesses were found, and none of them testified at the trial. And that's a function of our not doing what we're supposed to do, and by that I mean not effectively prosecuting cases. And when you don't effectively prosecute cases and people don't want to come forward for fear that the person they're going to testify to will be back on the street and living next to them the next week, that creates a lack of distrust or a lack of trust. And it's a circle, and until you break out of that circle and start to make those changes, the trust just never builds, and you can't prove crimes, the crimes keep occurring, people keep getting victimized, and there's no way to break out of it.
Yeah, certainly there's a lack of trust in the community, especially in some of our more challenging. Certainly there is a lack of trust in the community,
And it is our job in law enforcement to continue to build that trust. And like Deb said, this is generational, right? So we're dealing with mistrust that goes back generations and generations, and coupled with the fact why we see national incidents, we see local incidents where the trust is hurt by some bad apples. So it's up to us, me as the law enforcement leader, to hold those officers accountable. And part of the way to build that trust is letting the community see us in those non-enforcement interactions. So engaging with the community like we have never done before. And so it's not all about just arresting the bad guys in our community. It's also about talking to kids, visiting with our schools and reading to our children, having them see law enforcement in those non-enforcement type situations. I've been to this rec center. Our officers and deputies have been to these rec centers, interacting with the kids, trying to build that trust. But when we have a local incident, that it really breaks down that trust. So that's why it's important for me as leader to hold those officers accountable, as deputies accountable. And part of doing that is part of making those tough decisions. I think I've terminated more officers at the Orlando Police Department than any other chief of police there. And now that I'm sheriff, I'm going to hold our officers accountable as well. But I do want to thank the Players Coalition for having this forum. This is such a great forum for us to tell you what we're doing right, tell you what we're doing wrong, and trying to fix that, but also to hear some of your concerns as well. Thank you.
Thank you. First, thank you guys for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. This is an important conversation. So why is the relationship strained between the community and law enforcement? It's strained because probable cause in one area of the community is not probable cause in another. What's probable cause in Pine Hills is not probable cause in Winter Garden. It's not probable cause in Lake Nona. It's not probable cause in Winter Park, okay? And until we have probable cause be a standard throughout the community, we're gonna have these problems. Sheriff Mina came out a couple months ago against legalization of marijuana. He said he didn't support it. And I got to thinking, this year, how many times has that impacted our communities? So far this year, today I just received the Freedom of Information request from Sheriff Mina's office. Through the end of July, there have been 1,100 arrests for misdemeanor amounts of marijuana possession in Orange County by the Sheriff's Office. Black folks make up 21% of the population in Orange County. Of those 1,100 arrests, 58% of them were of African Americans. We are going to continue to have a broken system and bad relationships until there is actual equal justice in Orange County.
Testing. Okay. First of all, I want to thank the Players Coalition for the invite and for the community coming out here today to hear us and to listen to some of your questions. Anquan, my condolences for your loss. I think what you had to go through, you and your family, is horrific, especially when you have somebody out there who's supposed to protect and serve. Do I believe that there's a disconnect between law enforcement and the community, especially those of color? Absolutely. And I understand this very well for several reasons. Number one, born and raised in the Bronx, I know how it is growing up in an intercity where you have people who are treated differently. When I was working in Miami on the Violent Street Crime Task Force in Liberty City, one of our goals was to go ahead and to go after the people who were robbing the tourists. But at the same time, what I would do is I would go into the projects, the Scott projects. If anybody here from Miami and Liberty City, they understand those projects. I would go into those projects and I would talk to the young kids in those projects. And when they saw me, they thought I was there to arrest their mother or father. But I was there actually to educate them, to tell them that we're not only here making arrests, because there was a lot of police officers, there was task force down there. As I walked the community for the last year and a half, I've been knocking on doors in some of these communities, and they're telling me that they don't trust the police. There's an FBI report out. In 2015, the FBI decided that they were going to try to find a way to collect information on excessive use of force. So they created the FBI National Excessive Use of Force data. So what that does is, because they had no idea how much excessive use of force was being done by police department because they weren't reporting it. So as they found out, no surprise to anybody, the number one thing that causes distrust between law enforcement and the community is excessive use of force. Excessive use of force. The number two thing was transparency and accountability. So we have to be aware of the problems that we got. So right now we have the city of Orlando under Sheriff Mina, $3 million worth of paid out of excessive use of force, and that continues. This is why there's still a disconnect. We can no longer be doing optics. We need to be in the community. We need to make sure that the community understands that we're there to stay and develop relationships, not through optics, not throwing a football, and not putting food in people's stomach, but being out there creating real relationships and talking to the group, including doing an intergroup theory where you get people from the community and people from law enforcement, and you go to places that are safe, that's not threatening to anybody to the community, and have some serious conversations and have their input. One of the things the community feels disconnect, because they don't feel included. So you got to include them. Part of the democratic policing is what it's called. Thank you.
I'm going to start this next one with Sheriff Mina. Noel Carter recently filed suit against the Orlando Police Department and Mayor Dwyer. For those of you who don't know, in 2015, he was arrested for battery and resisting arrest. Cell phone footage showed Orlando Police Department officers kicking him as he sat on the curb. As chief at the time, how did you feel when you watched that video? How were those officers disciplined, and what is it that we need to understand about that situation?
So first I want to address the couple of statements that were already made about me. I'll just say that the arrests for people who are in the sole possession of misdemeanor cannabis is extremely low priority for us in Orange County. And if you look at the jail records today, in the Orange County Jail, there is not a single person incarcerated in jail for the sole possession of misdemeanor cannabis. So that's because this community, our sheriff's office, the Orlando Police Department, that's a low priority crime, and we're not focused on it. We're focused on dangerous drugs like heroin and opioids. Secondly, the other statement about the $3 million in payouts, that was from 2010 to 2014 before I was chief of police. And so since I was chief of police at the Orlando Police Department, I reduced the amount of lawsuits and payouts by 75%. So about the Noel Carter case, since it is a pending litigation, myself, Mayor Buddy Dyer are named in the lawsuit. I'm not going to get into the details of that case. I will say that the reports by that person's lawyer were very false and inaccurate. I'll also say that case was investigated by an independent party, something that we do really well here for very serious cases. That case was investigated not by the Orlando Police Department, but by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They gave it to the state attorney's office, who cleared those officers of any criminal wrongdoing. And when I first watched the tape, I was very upset. I found that very concerning. But as the whole incident unfolded, it really did paint a better picture of that entire incident. Like, again, I'm going to say that it's pending litigation. I'm going to have to testify. For all I know, the lawyer for that case is here today. I don't think it's proper for me to go into details about that case. But happy to talk about use of force in general and my record as far as decreasing use of force, decreasing officer-involved shootings, decreasing citizen complaints on our officers, decreasing the amount of lawsuits paid out by our officers because of policies that I implemented and changed at the Orlando Police Department. And a real quick example is I saw there was too many officer-involved shootings where our officers were shooting at moving vehicles, way too many. I changed that policy, and because of the change in that policy, we were able to reduce the amount of police officer-involved shootings by almost 40%. So real change is taking place. It's not going to happen overnight, okay? I tell you that, and I promise you, and you'll see it through my record, that I hold our officers accountable. And not every situation I think the community's going to agree with. Not every situation is our union going to agree with. But we have to make those tough decisions sometimes as leaders, and I have a proven record of doing that.
For the other two sheriff's candidates, if you could talk about, in general, I guess, how you would handle if you were the sheriff and were looking at videos like that, and saw excessive use of force. How do you handle that?
So I think one of the first things, actually I'll go ahead and reveal it here today. It's a plan that I'm working on now to have, the sheriff talked about the independent agencies to review these instances. Well, officer-involved shootings are rare, luckily for us here in Orange County, but they do happen. So one of the things that also erodes trust in the community is law enforcement investigating law enforcement. If you want to have a truly neutral party investigate, and I'm working up the details of this plan now, but I want a public defender's office from outside of Orange County to investigate all officer-involved shootings. So what does this do? This allows individuals who are generally involved in officer-involved shootings, the civilian, the resident who is involved in this, generally is going to have some sort of charges pending against them. So I don't want to conflict off the people here in Orange County who work with our residents every day, who know our residents, and who know how to properly defend our residents. But what it also doesn't do is it doesn't allow law enforcement to investigate law enforcement. And it allows the state attorney's office as well to stay clear, because oftentimes the state attorney's office is seen as an extension of law enforcement. They are who prosecutes these cases. If we can get a public defender's office from outside of this county, there is no office, I can promise you now, that is more skeptical of police statements than any public defender's office. I know, I work there. So that's my plan for the officer-involved shootings. I do think it's sort of interesting that the sheriff wasn't able to comment on the case other than to say everything was a lie. Amen. Other than to say the complaint is just untrue. So if we're going to not talk about a case, let's not talk about a case. If we're going to talk about it, let's talk about it. At the end of the day, I am here to tell you, if you want incremental change, either one of these two gentlemen are it. If you want genuine change at the foundation of the very criminal justice system, I am your candidate, and I am the type of sheriff that Orange County needs and frankly deserves. Thank you.
I think what Andrew is talking about is we need more transparency and stop misleading, right? What I would tell you what I would do is what I have done. When I was at the FHP, I was the chief of investigations, what oversaw the internal affairs. And there was an MOU in place anytime there's a police officer shooting that strikes somebody. We have an MOU with FDLE. Now, what I just tell you about one incident, there was a shooting down in Miami. I was in Tallahassee. It was over investigations, and I flew down there because it was a death. And I went down there to make sure that it was being handled properly and that the state attorneys are informed. So basically, all cases, not only shootings, anytime there's any use of force that has some serious injuries, including any implication of excessive, whether it's through a weapon or through bodily harm, that all cases, once they're investigated, are sent to the state attorney's office for probable cause to see if there's any criminal violations of the law. That's one thing, all cases. We will not take 11 months to send any case and to invest any case. There will be a timeline on all cases. For instance, at the Florida Highway Patrol, you have 45 to 60 days to investigate all cases, all excessive use of force, all cases. And if the cases are not submitted, not completed, the local commander would have to ask for an extension, and depending on the circumstances. That's one of the things. We have a discipline review board at FHP, which means that any case that was completed of the investigation is reviewed by legal, by human resource, and some commanders, all right? And then that's for after it comes back from the state attorney's office, because once they find out there's no criminal charges, they send it back over. Now, there's an MOU in place with a lot of police departments with FDLE on the same thing that I just described. So, yes, sometimes other law enforcement agencies have to investigate, but one of the things that I want to bring on board is including the community, is to, after a case has been completed and investigated, they get one more set of eyes. One of the things, the problems you have with investigating criminal internal affairs cases is that you have the Policeman Bill of Act in Florida State. So it gives you 180 days to investigate a case. 180 days is not much time to investigate and get a lot of eyes on it and so forth. Because if you don't investigate it within 180 days, what happens is the police officer could be set free. He won't be disciplined. So you have to be very careful, and you have a short timeline. But there needs to be a timeline on it, not 11 months to investigate an excessive use of force. Any excessive use of force, there should be zero tolerance. Zero tolerance. Anybody who violates that civil rights of anybody, excessive use of force, there should be criminal charges filed against them.
And for our prosecutors, and we'll start with Mr. Williams, how do you hold police accountable for incidents like these? Are prosecutors sometimes hesitant to hold officers accountable because these are the people you work with to make cases? And what are the other impediments to holding police accountable in excessive force situations?
Well, I guess I'll start by addressing something Mr. Darling said. I thought we were supposed to be looking for the truth. And I say that because I don't really understand the point of giving cases over to the public defender's office because they're more skeptical. The search is for the truth. And I completely disagree with you that the state attorney's office looks at cases because they have relationships with law enforcement. Yes, we have relationships with law enforcement. I have relationships with people in the office of the public defender, and I work with them every day. Does that mean I want to set every person who's arrested for a crime free? I don't think so. Now, one of the things, it's okay, you guys talked a lot, so the lawyers will talk a little bit.
Yeah, I'm one of those too. Thank you.
It's a matter of having enough confidence from the community that you're doing that very thing, that you're seeking the truth and not a predetermined outcome. I know I have actually just finished prosecuting a case where waiting on a verdict tomorrow where 2 officers were killed. Now, I have also prosecuted multiple cases where officers were accused of excessive use of force. And never once in that situation did I ask myself what I thought the media would do or how I thought Sheriff Mina, then Chief Mina, what he would think about that circumstance. Because you follow the facts and you evaluate the facts and you let the facts in the law take you where you're supposed to go. Now, the important thing is that the community has to understand that. And the only way, in my view, they're going to understand that is if they see a pattern over time of prosecutors in the office of the state attorney prosecuting officers when appropriate, prosecuting non-officers when appropriate, and making fact-based determinations without a preconceived agenda. Now, of course, I understand that law enforcement use of force is a problem, and it's a bigger problem in communities that have different color skin than I do. But that doesn't mean that we automatically assume that every law enforcement officer is guilty because we have a constitution that protects everyone, including law enforcement officers.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I've got to go back to my card now. Yeah, just asking how you hold officers accountable for these situations. Do you think prosecutors are sometimes hesitant to hold officers accountable because it's who you work with to make cases? And what are maybe some other impediments to holding officers accountable?
Okay. Yeah, no, I don't think that there is any issue in terms of if somebody commits a crime, they get held responsible. It doesn't matter who you are. It's not an officer-specific crime or standard. If you're a politician and you commit a crime and we can prove it, we will prosecute you. If you work at a cell phone store and you commit a crime, we will prosecute you. If you are a law enforcement officer and you commit a crime, we will prosecute you. I personally have prosecuted law enforcement officers. I've prosecuted 3 in my career, not because I take any joy in prosecuting law enforcement officers, but because they committed a crime. I went to trial on an officer on an excessive use of force, which was a shooting, and I persuaded a jury of 6 people that that officer should be held accountable, and he was found guilty as charged by a jury here in Orange County, Florida, in our circuit. It's not a prosecutor cop, prosecutor community, it's crime. And prosecutors will prosecute crime. And if the community doesn't trust in prosecutors, that's a problem. And I do think that that exists. I do think that that kind of prosecutors are extension of law enforcement, and that we are, I guess, making bargains or doing whatever. I do think that that is a reality, and I think that we need to communicate better to explain why we do the things that we do. And we need to get out that if you are a victim of a crime and it is an officer who committed that crime, you need to come to us. We will review it and we will handle that case. Every shooting that law enforcement does, I review at the state attorney's office. Every time somebody pulls the trigger on their firearm, I review it. And I review them as murder and attempted murder cases. And you need the investigation to be done by law enforcement because those are murder cases. You can't have people who aren't trained in forensics. You can't have people who don't have that background and that skill set of interviewing witnesses. You need people who are going to give you the best investigation possible. And when I get an investigation and there are things that are missing, I reach out to law enforcement and I say, this is what I need. That is exactly what I did with the Pulse investigation. I've spent 6 months reviewing every single piece of evidence that was brought forward and that the FBI collected so that I could determine the facts. And I didn't care what the facts were. I didn't care if law enforcement fired and hit a civilian. That's not my job. What I'm trying to do is get the facts as to what happened based on the evidence. And that is what prosecutors should be doing in every single case. And if this is a distrust in law enforcement and police, then prosecutors are the gap between police and the community. We are the common denominator. The community needs us, law enforcement needs us. We need the community and we need law enforcement. And so bringing everybody together, there shouldn't be a community meeting without a prosecutor when we're talking to the police. The police shouldn't be having meetings with all of you without a prosecutor there. We have to get on the same page, and if we do that, we can do great things.
I'll go back to our sheriff candidates, and I'll start down with Mr. Lopez since he's always been at the end of this. Recently nearby, the Plainview Project exposed 16 current Lake County officers who had racist, sexist, and violence-promoting social media posts. All of them kept their jobs. Do you understand why this causes many in the community to distrust law enforcement? How would you handle situations like this? And how do you create a culture in your department where these kind of things don't happen?
Well, I'm not familiar with the case in detail, but I'm going to talk about that type of culture.
Yeah, I'm not worried about
Yeah.
the specifics of that
So
case.
that many police officers to be charged with that, there's a problem with the leadership, okay? There's a culture that exists there. Coming from a very white organization, the Florida Highway Patrol, believe it or not, had a zero tolerance on any racism, any discrimination, including that if you are an observant in a room and you see something, it is your duty to report it, number one. Number two, that's, again, it goes back to transparency and accountability. How many times have these officers probably have done something in the past and we're giving a free pass, not to be held accountable? Also, you also have a problem too, is that department also reflective of the community? One of the things that I want to do when I become Orange County Sheriff is to ensure that our department, that the Sheriff's Office, is reflective of the community. You have cultures, different cultures here. This is another melting pot, and people need to understand that we're living amongst other different cultures, and sensitivity training. The other thing, the problem too, is I'm sure that's probably all on social media, some of that stuff that happened.
Yes.
Okay, because that's usually where it starts. Well, there's probably lacking any policy on social media. Again, from my experience in the Florida Highway Patrol, we had a zero tolerance on social media. So you're a police officer 24/7. You're using just the credibility of a police officer. Here's the problem that you have. Anytime you have any type of discrimination, any racial tones open publicly, that deteriorates the trust of the community, including when you go and testify in court. People don't understand. As a police officer, you're an officer of the court. So when you go to court to testify in any case proceedings, and they bring this up, what do you think is going to happen to that case? I guarantee you the state attorney is going to have a problem with that. So it's part of the moral character of a police officer. And now in these days, when you do become a police officer and you do apply, what's the first thing that the background investigator does? They go to your Facebook accounts to see if you have any, open comments about racial tone. Zero tolerance.
Very good.
Yeah, so the instance with the deputies in Lake County, they all kept their jobs, and Lake County is also the county that Mr. Williams works in. Lake County is also still relying on these officers to come to testify in court and be credible witnesses against residents in that community. So I didn't even tell you guys a little bit about myself, and I apologize for that. So when I tell you guys I'm from here, I'm a husband and a father. I'm an Oak Ridge High School graduate. So when I grew up on Americana, I didn't want to see law enforcement or the state attorney's office. Okay, and I think there's a huge disconnect here in everyday folks and hearing people talk about, well, if we get out in our communities more, you are in our communities. You're just not doing the right things. And that's the problem. So one of the first things I want to institute to make sure that policies like this social media stuff is on day one, I want to implement a civilian review board that actually has teeth, which is something Sheriff Mina has refused to do.
So let's talk about the Lake County case. The good news is we're in Orange County, and we're a very diverse community. We're a very welcoming community. Both the major agencies in this community, both the Orlando Police Department and the Orange County Sheriff's Office, are extremely diverse. And if you check the numbers, probably some of the most diverse organizations, not only in the state, but in the country. So let's talk about social media. It's important to have a policy. It's important to have officers accountable and deputies accountable. So every single time I talk to officers and deputies, I talked about social media because it's so far-reaching. At all the cases, very high-profile cases I had at the Orlando Police Department, the social media case was the case I heard from in the community the most. They knew the officer's first name, his last name, where he was transferred to, where he was transferred back to, what kind of discipline he received. The outreach from that is just so far-reaching. So have to have policies in place. The officer was disciplined, hampered a little bit by past practice. But what I did do, moving forward, if I could answer, what I did do moving forward was create a policy at the Orlando Police Department that a violation of the social media policy could lead up to termination. And since that policy was implemented, there have been no social media cases at that police department. Okay, so it's very, very important to have a social media policy in place. It's important to hold the officers accountable. And what I do is I talk to them every single time about social media because how far-reaching that is and how that affects every single person, how that affects our community. So this is what I'm going to do and what I have done at the Orange County Sheriff's Office regarding social media. We have not had any cases. I feel very, very good about that. I think the officers and deputies get it. They realize that. We're human, we make mistakes. In all professions, unfortunately, there's implicit bias, something that we talked about before, that's something that we need to train for, that we need to stop, and it starts with looking at social media like we do. We check every single applicant's social media account before that we hire on. And so out of respect for the crowd, and I think it's time to move on so that we don't have the antics from some of the crowd. I'm happy to answer any questions. I think it's kind of improper to shout out things. I think we should keep this very civil. Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that just a little. Let's let them answer, and then hopefully everybody will get their questions answered as time goes. For our state attorney candidates, State Attorney Ayala recently implemented a policy mandating disclosure to defense counsel of any allegations of officer misconduct, including allegations of racism and sexism. She also implemented a policy precluding officers from testifying in criminal trials if they are accused of serious misconduct. How do you feel about these policies? And what policies would you propose to promote trust from the communities? You can
Great.
start.
So what we refer to it is a Brady list. Basically, what it is that when there's misconduct by an officer, if that officer has a pending case or a past case where they were a material witness in it, that they testified, we send notice to the defense attorney saying, hey, we want you to know that this officer has issues and to look at the case. What Ms. Ayala did on top of that, because we've been doing that for years and years, that has always been, that's the law. We've had to do that. But what we've done now under State Attorney Ayala's administration is that we've taken it a step further in terms of keeping that information in a central location, which I think is a great idea, because what happens is we have a lot of turnover of officers and state attorneys. And what happens is that an assistant state attorney will get assigned to a case, and there may have been a Brady notice that's gone out saying, hey, this officer might have some issues. Well, about 3 months later, 6 months later, that attorney is no longer assigned to that case. We have a different assistant state attorney on that case, and they have no knowledge of that. And this way, it keeps it centralized so that everybody in the office knows who's on this list. And why that is important is because we have body camera footage. And the fact that law enforcement is outfitted with body cameras is a really good thing. The problem with that is we don't have the resources of the time to review every second of every body camera. For one incident, it might be 6 hours of body camera footage that we would have to review, and we just don't have the manpower. What this list does is it gives our prosecutors a heads up. It basically says, hey, you will want to look at this body camera footage just to make sure that the officer was acting the way that the officer should have acted. And I think that that is a very good thing internally as we progress in a case moving forward, whether we decide to charge the case, what type of resolution we have. Now, what I am kind of concerned about and that I don't love is a blanket policy of we would never call that officer to the witness stand. Because I do believe that there could be circumstances in which we would want to call that officer to protect the community. And here's what I mean. If that officer who is on that list goes out to a murder scene and that officer happened to be the one to find the murder weapon, and we have a dead citizen that needs justice, for us to say we were never calling that person to the witness stand could prevent us from getting a conviction on that case. And so I do think you have to look at everything as a case-by-case basis moving forward, but I think the organization of identifying where there are issues with law enforcement credibility is an important thing for the office.
Yeah, Brady is the law, and it refers to a case, Brady versus Maryland, in the states. Prosecutors are required to turn over any information about an officer that the defense could use in order to impeach them or question their credibility, and that's been the law for nearly 40 years now. I agree, let me say it this way, I applaud Ms. Ayala's implementation of a Brady list, but I agree with Ms. Barra that you cannot have categorical decisions in this situation, and I would actually use a different example. Mr. Van Gundy referenced the fact that the state attorney has the option of deciding to never call a witness if they've been accused of a crime. Well, imagine as a citizen if you were accused of a crime and your employer said, well, you're terminated no matter whether you're found innocent or not guilty no matter what. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We have to notify the defense about that, and we should obviously make sure that we hold law enforcement accountable if they've committed a crime or violated the public trust in some way. But to say that because an officer has been accused of wrongdoing, that we can't call them as a witness, I think it would be unfair to that officer, just like it would be unfair to a citizen who was accused of something and did not do it.
All right, we'll start this one with Mr. Darling. Just quickly, if you have any thoughts on that policy in terms of how it affects law enforcement, and also you'd already mentioned this, but I was going to ask you all on your thoughts of civilian oversight boards and their role in holding police departments accountable.
So to touch on the second part first, the Civilian Oversight Board is the first step to engage the community and fix the broken relationship. That's the first step. That's the baseline. We have to start there. If you don't include the community in the policing, if you have a police force that occupies a community but is not part of that community, that's a problem. And we need to have that implemented quickly. As far as the Brady List requirements, that's an easy fix from the head law enforcement officer in the county. If you have officers that are on a Brady List, they are not going to be called at trial. They are a liability. They cannot perform their duties as a law enforcement officer. If they cannot testify at trial, they do not need to be law enforcement officers for my agency.
Like I said earlier before, whenever it is, and so everybody understands about the misconduct, anything about misconduct refers to the credibility of a police officer, the integrity, the moral character, moral turpitude. So I have to agree with Andrew, because back in my agency, my old agency, we had a situation where we had a trooper who lied in a deposition. And if you cannot perform the duties of a law enforcement officer, and as part of your job description is to testify in court, collect evidence and all that good stuff, then you cannot be a law enforcement officer. One of the things that you can get decertified from the criminal justice and standards is perjury. So when the credibility is at stake, you're losing the trust of the community. In my old agency, you were arrested, period. For any misdemeanor, you were no longer a trooper. That's why I'm proud, to say that I'm a state trooper, because we had a good reputation. Did you want me to talk about the CRB?
If you would like to, yeah.
Now, here, the CRB was part of Orange County. Under Jerry Demings in 2009, a court ruling that the Community Relations Board was ruled unconstitutional. If you know that, you can do the research on that. I believe we must hold our police officers accountable. There are other methods that we still can do this. So one of the things that we have to do is to make sure that our policy is reviewed every year. Part of internal affairs, we make sure we review that to make sure that the policy was up to date. What am I talking about? I'm talking about things anytime that any officer is engaged in the use of control. Back in my old agency, if you had 3 or more users of control, you were reviewed, you were brought in from remedial training, and you were put on a watch list. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, we need to make sure that these cases, again, are investigated in a timely fashion. You put a deadline on it. 3, you got to make sure once that case is fully investigated, that it's sent over to the state attorney's office to make sure that whether or not there's probable cause to file charges. Again, I do not object in having a board of qualified citizens. 8% of cases sent nationwide, there's research on this, 8% of cases sent to community relations boards in the country are found not sustained. There's something wrong there. Why? Because there's no funding, there's conflict of interest, there's whole sorts of things. People go on those boards for certain reasons. You got to pay them. There's a lot of problems with that. As we saw, that some community relations boards sometimes that they just don't work. So let's use something that does work. I'm very proud again from the Florida Highway Patrol that we did not have that problem when it came to that, because we held our people accountable.
So first question, as far as the Brady List, yeah, absolutely, that's been a law for several years. The Orange County Sheriff's Office complies with that and gives names of officers and deputies to the state's attorney's office. most of those officers who are on, and deputies and on the Brady list are officers who are, or deputies who are arrested and then terminated. So there's no current deputies on the Brady list. So if we do have a deputy is arrested or going to be terminated for a serious charge, yeah, we give that information to the state attorney's office all the time. Now, it's all about having a good relationship with the state attorney's office, and I know that they just called over today asking about some things, and that's the kind of communication that we need back and forth, especially when it deals with the Brady list. So as far as the Citizen Review Board, had one when I was with the City of Orlando. I do have a Citizens Advisory Council at the Orange County Sheriff's Office. It's made up of 10 people. 6 people are picked by the Orange County Commissioners, and we meet every single month. And so one of the things I told them last month is, as we try to define their role under their new sheriff, is how they want to be utilized. So we talked about reviewing policies. So one of the things they're going to look at is, as we delve into this world of facial recognition, we need to have a policy about it, so there's no abuses of facial recognition. So the Citizens Review Board at their next meeting is actually going to review our facial recognition policy. And then further, what I told them is I would like for them to review any of our serious use of force cases or high profile cases or any other cases that they hear about, that they see in the news, and review that and tell us what they think and tell us how we can move forward to do better. Because here in the state of Florida, because of the laws that were already passed, because of the decisions the Florida State Supreme Court met, that the citizen review boards here, they don't have that teeth. They can't subpoena officers. That's a decision that was made by the Florida Supreme Court. But what we can do is we can listen to them. And when I was chief at the Orlando Police Department, the Citizen Review Board made numerous recommendations to me. Some of those recommendations are in policy today. One of them was the social media policy. The Citizen Review Board at the Orlando Police Department recommended to me, I was chief at the time, that they wanted to put it in that policy that if someone an officer violated our social media policy, that they could be terminated. We did that the next month. That's in that policy today, so that those officers can now, they're on notice, they can now be held accountable and they can be disciplined under these new guidelines and not some of the past practice. So that's something, those are some of the things that my Citizens Advisory Council is going to be doing at the Orange County Sheriff's Office, reviewing policy, reviewing high profile cases to see how we can get better moving forward.
Okay, last question from me going to our state attorney candidates. We'll start with Mr. Williams. Just talk to us about how helpful and useful body camera footage is, and a question in terms of transparency. When should body camera evidence be released to the public?
Very helpful. Video has revolutionized our society, and it's no different with law enforcement. It's an affirmative good that the state attorney's office and the public can see what our law enforcement officers are doing on a daily basis. It's a lot of footage, as Ms. Barra alluded to. It's a lot of responsibility and workload that's placed on the prosecutors. But body camera footage has made our job, I'm not going to say it's easier, because people will dispute things that are on video, as we all know, but it's certainly made things more clear than if the video footage wasn't there. I think transparency is a really good thing. I think people who are not doing anything wrong have nothing to fear from everybody watching what they do, and I think that most professionals in law enforcement feel the same way. As regards to the release of body camera footage, our public records laws are pretty clear. They're also very robust, and you can get a lot of things within the state of Florida through a public records request. And I would support the releasing body camera footage in every instance unless it's prohibited by law. And so, for example, you cannot release video if there is some of the death or murder of a law enforcement officer. I think everybody can appreciate why we don't do that. So again, people like to speak in absolutes, which every time. I understand the sentiment. We always want it released, but the law, as in most instances, governs when we can and when we can't. But if possible, I would support releasing that footage, and I think transparency is a positive for our community.
Yeah, for me, body camera footage is a game changer. It really is. It changes, and it gives a voice to the community, and it also gives a voice to law enforcement. A lot of times members of the community will say something and you're judging credibility and you're left almost in the dark. You have one person saying this thing, another person saying the other thing, and you look to the body camera footage. And thank God that it's there, because I think that a lot of things prior to body camera footage happened, and that those stories were told and nothing came about it. And now they provide a sense of accountability for what actually takes place. And I think that for me, anytime if I see body camera footage in which somebody is walking over to another officer and that officer makes a point of saying, hey, I'm live, and click the body camera footage off, that's a really disturbing proposition. It doesn't show anything, but it shows, okay, here's the mentality. And there's going to be an adjustment in terms of everything we do is recorded, and I understand from an officer perspective that's got to feel weird, but they're going to have to get over it. And they're going to have to put it on camera, because that is what is expected. That is what I look to, because now credibility is a whole other game. I do believe that in the past it was an officer's word against somebody else, and the officer always got the benefit of the doubt. I think body camera gives you, here's the truth. Here's what happened. On the other side, I do think that there are complaints against law enforcement that are not substantiated by the body camera footage. And this is something that should be embraced by all and every police agency, and it should be embraced by every prosecution office. And we need more staff and personnel so that we can review the body cam footage in every case. Because again, it is so vast. I mean, you have 4 officers responding to one scene, and that might take, 17 hours of body cam footage. We can't sit at our desk and watch 17 hours of body camera footage, but if a citizen complains and says, hey, during this encounter with law enforcement, this is what this officer did to me, we can pull that up, we can review it, and we can act on it. And that's about doing the right thing at all times, and body cameras are the best tool in which we get a clear, open picture of exactly what happened.
Okay, I'm going to give up my seat to Quentin Richardson to bring some questions from you out there to the panel. For those of you who don't know, Quentin Richardson, longtime NBA player. I was fortunate enough to coach and then to work with after he was done playing, and he'll take my seat.
How's everybody doing out there? Like Bo, these questions are from the you guys in the community, so here we go. I guess this is for everybody up here. It says, how do we better train and educate our youth for police encounters?
So great question. I think that's so very important. So as the father of 2 boys, I had the advantage, and they had the advantage of me telling them as they got into that, driving, as they start getting their driver's license and taking that test. And I told them what you're supposed to do when a police officer pulls you over. And yes, you're supposed to move over. You're supposed to stop right away. It's very helpful if you have tinted windows and you roll those windows down and you put your hands where the officer can see that, and you turn your dome light out. So, but not everyone has the benefit of having a police officer as a father. So what we did when I was at the Orlando Police Department, we had teen forums right here, right? So where we would take the teens, we would put them in role-playing situations, and one teen as the driver, one team as the passenger, and then we'd have officers come up and role-play the traffic stop to kind of learn about how the police interaction works. And so then what we also did is we put the officers in that position as the driver and the passenger, and we had the teens come up, so the teens got a better sense of what the officer is going through when they approach a vehicle. So what we also do at both the Orlando Police Department and the Orange County Sheriff's Office is called the Teen Police Academy. So about 3 times every summer for a week, we have teens from this community and it's open and free to everyone. So about 60 in each class, so it's almost 180 kids, come in and learn about the sheriff's office. They learn what we do. We try to get them interested in law enforcement because we want to recruit from this area. And so it's so very important for them to kind of see us as moms and dads, as brothers and sisters, and see us in the non-enforcement type situations that I always talk about. So that's just another way. And then finally, the formal and informal community interactions that we did while I was chief at the Orlando Police Department, and that we're doing now while I'm sheriff. And that's talking about having community barbecues and playing sports with our kids and reading to our kids. Again, so they're seeing us in that non-enforcement type situation. So, especially in some of our more challenging areas, many times historically, police are viewed as the person who comes to make the arrest. Well, we can't always be seen like that, so we have to engage with our citizens like never before and show them that we're not all about just arresting the bad guy. We're not about just breaking up the fight. We're here, we're mentors, we're teachers, and so that's the kind of things that I did as chief at the Orlando Police Department. That's the kind of things I'm doing at the Orange County Sheriff's Office. And, people may laugh at my community barbecues, and they kind of didn't grasp the concept when I became sheriff, the deputies, and they're like, well, what are we doing out there? They're like, Sheriff, are you going to speak? I'm like, no, it's not about me. It's about you interacting with our youth and our children in non-enforcement type situations. So while the kids are talking with the deputies and playing football and catch with the deputies, the commanders are actually talking to their parents about issues that those parents want to talk about in their communities, about crime issues in their communities. So very successful. So in conclusion, it takes us not only those formal interactions, but those informal actions, getting out of our patrol cars, talking to our youth, being mentors, leaders, coaches, like Mr. Boldin said before, and being in the community and showing a positive role model for our youth.
So I want to categorically deny that it's children who need to learn how to deal with police. That is 100% false, okay? I will tell you this, and this is very personal to me. I am probably the first person, matter of fact, I know I am because I asked my dad about this. I am the first person in my lineage for the history of forever who has ever gotten the talk about police officers. And I got that because I played football at Oak Ridge High School, and my dad wasn't in my life at the time. But I had so many incredible black men mentor me, and so many incredible black men who are amazing fathers to their children. They had that conversation with me. My wife is from Ghana in West Africa. I have 2 biracial children. At the end of the day, my son, in the eyes of law enforcement, is black. There is no way around that. In December, 3 days after Sheriff Mina swore in, my son and his friend, also a young biracial kid, my son is 8 years old. He's big for his age, but he's 8 years old, okay? My son and a 7-year-old, they told me they missed the bus. Yeah, I think they skipped the bus and they were gonna try to walk to school. That's what I think happened, okay? They walked down my street to the Walmart that has a gas station out in Winter Garden, okay? They were there, an Orange County Sheriff deputy, somebody called the Orange County Sheriff's deputy at 8:30 in the morning on 2 biracial kids at the Walmart gas station. Not accused of any crime other than not being in school. 2 officers came, 2 sheriff's deputies, this is in unincorporated Orange County, put my 8-year-old son in handcuffs, put my 8-year-old son in the back of his police car and told him he was taking him to prison. He took my son to school. I went down to the Orange County Sheriff's Office about a month later after I'd calmed down, and I went to the sheriff's office and I asked, hey, how do we figure out the name of the officer that responded to this call? They looked up. They couldn't find a call. They couldn't find the officer. There's a benefit in that my son's name was not put in the system. There's a huge benefit to that. I can understand some sort of older mentality of scared straight. Let's make sure this kid goes to school. He doesn't do whatever. The first interaction for a 7- and 8-year-old brown boy with police was handcuffs in the back of a deputy's car, and that is completely unacceptable.
Wow, 8 years old, handcuffs. I don't see any need for that. But let me talk about what would I do. Mentoring and developing kids at a young age has a profound effect. I've been invited, I don't know if some of you know Dr. Daniel Ings, who runs a program of Boys to Men. I've been asked to go there several times and talk to the kids. So we can, what the community doesn't want are programs enforced on them, compelled for them to participate. What I've heard when I'm in the community, they got programs. And the ones who are going to come to these camps and everything are usually people probably want to become cops or they want to do good things. But you really got to get to the root of the problem. Coming from the inner city, you got to go into the inner city. You got to go there and talk to the kids, talk to the parents. They're going to be reluctant. When they saw me, they were reluctant. That's obvious. But you got to talk to them, and you got to talk really real to them. And you got to educate them. It's all about education. You got to go to their schools. You got to talk to the schools. When I was part of community policing in Miami as a state trooper back in the 90s, part of our responsibilities was to identify schools that we would talk to where there wasn't too much police interaction. And we would go in there, and there would be a different topic, whether it be say no to guns, say no to drugs, or try to do something a difference and be in the community. Real talk is what they want. That's how you develop the one-on-one relationships. Having talk. Sports and music, we know it's a common thing that gravitates the youth from these communities. It's magic. So it's mentorship and developing. And you got to make it real, and they have to know what? That you're there to stay.
So I do want to respond to what Mr. Darling said about his son. And so I absolutely think that should not happen either. I wish you would have came in the next day. I think we could have got to the bottom of it. But this is the first time I'm hearing of this. I will say that there is no reason a 7, an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, 10-year-old should be put in handcuffs. And I'll apologize right now on behalf of the Orange County Sheriff's Office that should not happen to any child. So what I will do tomorrow is I will look at our policies, and if there is not a policy on handcuffing young juveniles, I will create a policy and make sure our deputies are following that policy, and then I'll follow up with the deputies to ensure that they know my philosophy. So law enforcement, we didn't get into this job to arrest kids. Absolutely not. You know, there are some juveniles in this community. There's one who's been arrested 80, 90 times for breaking into homes and houses. But the kids who don't need to be arrested, we shouldn't be arresting those kids. And certainly someone who was late to school shouldn't be scared straight by putting in handcuffs. So I do apologize on behalf of the Orange County Sheriff's Office for that.
You want us to answer that question? Sounds like more of a law enforcement question,
cool.
but it's up to you. I'll answer it if you want.
No, that's cool. We
Okay.
can keep it going. Okay, so we keep hearing when a cop does something wrong, it was just one bad apple. But how are the citizens to trust that? What is law enforcement doing differently in hiring, training, or training to weed out the bad apple or apples?
Yeah, so you do hear that a lot. So I'll start backwards. So when we have an incident, like I said, I've terminated more officers at the Orlando Police Department than any other chief of police. I'm going to hold our deputies accountable. Since being there, I've already terminated one. I've had one arrested, and there's going to be another termination as well. So holding officers accountable, but it does start at the beginning. It does start from the very beginning in recruiting, and I will not lie that in nationwide, recruiting law enforcement is an issue. Recruiting diversity is an issue, but what we cannot do is we cannot drop our standards to ensure that we are keeping the numbers up. So that includes checking social media. That includes polygraph or voice stress analysis tests to ensure that those bad apples aren't getting in. I will tell you that the Orange County Sheriff's Office, we have about 6,500 people apply to be sheriff's deputies, and not all of them are qualified to be sheriff's deputies. There's some people that we there's a pretty good percentage of people who don't pass the psychological. And so what we cannot do is we cannot drop our standards to meet those levels. We have to do better recruiting in some of our more diverse communities. And then it's got to start in the academy, holding our officers responsible, accountable. And I mean, if in terms of use of force, de-escalation training, crisis intervention training, for training our officers how to better deal with those who are going through mental crisis. Many of the police shootings that you see around the country are because of people in mental crisis. And I think you are definitely seeing a paradigm shift in that. You're seeing deputies and officers take a little bit of time, create a little bit of distance, de-escalate the situation, even when people are armed. That's the training that's going right now in your country and in your progressive law enforcement agencies, is using time and distance to de-escalate the situation, right? Using our words. So I think that the community needs to realize that not all cases of deadly force. Some cases, let me back that up. Some cases of deadly force will be justified, and some cases, some incidents cannot be de-escalated. And I'll use those highest one you could think of, Dayton, Ohio, right? A man running into a club shooting innocent people. That incident can't be de-escalated, right? The officers and deputies need to take action. But we, as law enforcement, we also need to realize that officers who use deadly force and who are wrong need to be held accountable. And that's why I'm proud that in this county we have arrested officers involved in shootings before. We have charged officers. We have terminated officers. We have given cases to the state attorney's office, who has prosecuted those officers right here in Orange County. That's happening. So it's all about recruitment, training, and accountability.
Yeah, so I'll briefly touch on this one. I don't think we need to lower the standards. I think we need to widen the net. So what that means is you have communities of color who have been systematically arrested and prosecuted for decades. You have people who are convicted of felonies when they were 17, 18 years old for bumping a teacher, for knocking over a teacher. Behavior we absolutely condemn, okay? When this person's been out in the real world being productive for 5, 10 years, no other traffic tickets, maybe this person shouldn't be disqualified from ever being a law enforcement officer. Okay? We need to widen our net from the communities that have been most brutalized by policing and over-aggressive policing tactics in order to make a more diversified force. In order to get into these communities and talk to people, you have to have people from the communities. If probable cause has been different in every community, like we talked about earlier, you're going to have a smaller number of people in particular communities who qualify to even go through the test, let alone people who, because of those experiences, want no part of being in law enforcement. And that's understandable. Training and standards is something I love. It's something that I do. I was a drill sergeant for a couple years in the Army. Training, I love it. So we are not going to lower the standards at all, but we are going to widen the net of people who are eligible to become law enforcement officers. And when we have a new progressive sheriff that Orange County needs and that Orange County deserves, we're going to attract the best and the brightest throughout the country who are tired of having to do things the way they've always done them. Because that's how stuff stays broken, when you keep doing them the way you've always done them.
Of course, it goes back to accountability and transparency. Unfortunately, the larger department you have, somebody will fall to the crack. Not using it as an excuse. So you got to continue to review the process to make sure that those are going through the process that are qualified. Again, I refer back to my career, is that we had several levels of screening. Whenever somebody was anywhere questionable, whether it was his finances, whether it was something that he did that he admitted to when he was a juvenile, whatever, it gets another set of eyes on there. I was part of that last set of eyes. Training. One of the things that we did a lot was training. And when I talk about training, real life scenarios, putting people through these scenarios, scenario-based training. A lot of scenario-based training is done at the academy, but it shouldn't stop at the academy. It should be continuing. Part of my career, I did also was I was in charge of training, and we made sure that everybody was on top of the latest trends that was going on. A lot of training on encountering citizens of different cultures, citizens of different race, and training where we would try to agitate the officers so they wouldn't overreact. So that's why you probably see a lot on the side of the road, people yelling at the trooper, and the trooper just standing there, just listening. So a lot of it has to do with listening and not overreact. So in holding supervisors accountable, one of the things that we did was we had supervisors were charged with the responsibility of reviewing the in-car camera video. They would randomly check a trooper once a week and look at, pick a month, the last 3 months, and pick a day and look at the video to make sure that there wasn't anything there. Something that the state attorneys referred to was any time that something came up we saw that wasn't right because they were going to go to court, we would go back and we would interview because a lot of stuff is done on the cameras. The cameras is a good thing because it keeps you honest. So it's basically going back to transparency and holding people accountable, including the supervisors who don't do their job when they're supposed to hold their subordinates accountable.
Thank you. This one is for you guys. How much authority do the assistant state attorneys have to do the right thing with cases, even if that means dropping the case against the wishes of a police officer? Do police officers have to consent to the dropping of the cases where the cops are the victim?
Who went first? I went first. That was your turn? Go ahead, ladies first.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so the assistant state attorneys have full autonomy in terms of doing the right thing. That is their number one job, is to do the right thing. And it doesn't matter what that right thing is. In some cases, doing the right thing is dropping a case, and sometimes it's not filing a case, and sometimes it's seeking the max penalty in a case. And as an assistant state attorney, you are confronted with a lot of different issues at a lot of different times. And this is probably the best example I can give you in terms of the power and the discretion of an assistant state attorney. There was a case that I prosecuted, and it was an armed robbery. And basically what happened is this guy approached this woman, pointed a gun at her, took her purse, took off, got into a vehicle, and drove away. And the woman was a very credible witness. She was able to identify the individual who did that in a photo lineup. He had a car that matched the vehicle that sped away from the scene, and there were anonymous tips saying that this is the individual who did it. She placed in a photo lineup. She identified the person out of the photo lineup. We were moving forward with prosecution in that case. We picked a jury. The jury was waiting for witnesses to get called, and I had a question about the identification, because something stood out to me in the narrative that I forgot to ask this witness, and it was that it took her a couple of minutes to identify the person after looking at the photo lineup. And in my experience, they see the person who committed a crime and they pick them out right away. And I knew I was going to ask that question on the witness stand. And so before I called her into the courtroom, I asked her, hey, what happened during the photo lineup? And what she told me was, actually, it was between two people. And I was struggling between these two, and the detective told me, well, that guy has the car that matches the description. So I heard that. There's a judge waiting, there's a jury waiting. I walked into the courtroom. I asked to approach. I told the judge that I was dropping that case. I did drop the case. I told the judge that the detective was present if he wanted to have a conversation with the detective about how screwed up that is. And then I went back to the victim, who is an innocent victim, who probably identified the right person, but probably is not enough. Every prosecutor under my administration will do the right thing, and they will know that beyond a reasonable doubt, that's a standard for the jury. For a prosecutor, it's beyond all doubt. A prosecutor will never take a case to trial that they don't believe in, that they're not convinced that this happened. And it doesn't matter what stage that happens. That was at a stage right before we were talking to the jury. And that is about doing the right thing, and that is what you have to empower prosecutors to do.
I agree. The problem is, my understanding is that that's not what's happening, and that prosecutors are not being given discretion to make decisions within the Office of the State Attorney, and that they're having to run it up 4 or 5 different chains of levels of supervision and dealing with supervisors or managers who may not know the file as well. Now, prosecutors have enormous authority, and I think we need to give our people as much discretion as possible to do the right thing, because that's, at the end of the day, what we're supposed to do. But we also need to have people that have the proper experience and training to know how to handle a given situation and what the right thing is in a given case. You have to remember that many of the prosecutors who start at the state attorney's office are 25 years old. And sometimes being a prosecutor is their first job out of law school, oftentimes. And if we don't give them some guidance from experienced people and a set of guidelines to follow, not tell them what to do in every situation, because at the end of the day, it has to be their decision, but give them some guidance and explain to them, you know, these are the things you look for, then they can't come to the right conclusion. And while I agree with Ms. Barra, I think if you talk to people in the law enforcement community and with victims, you'll find that the problem now is that no prosecutor can make a decision without getting 4 or 5 different levels of scrutiny, and that's not appropriate either. The final part of your question, Mr. Richardson, was, you know, do law enforcement officers have to consent? No, they don't. And the classic example is battering a law enforcement officer. It's alleged that a person strikes a law enforcement officer. Officers, however, are victims, and we have rights for victims in our state. We have a constitutional amendment that gives them rights, so they have to be consulted. Law enforcement should always be consulted, just like any other victim. Every victim should be consulted before a decision is made, but the Office of the State Attorney has to do what's in the best interest of the community under the law and what's right, regardless of the wishes of any given victim.
Thank you. You know, I wish we had more time to continue this conversation, but this is just the beginning of a long conversation that needs to be had in this country. I would like to thank our panel guests, all of them that we've seen today. And it's my hope that everybody that came out got something out of this forum, but more importantly, it's my hope that we all continue to stay involved in our justice system, whether that be calling elected officials, definitely voting, whatever it is, make sure that we all stay involved, because like we've all said today, this is important. And it doesn't just affect one group of people. It affects all of us as Americans. So thank you for coming out, and continue to stay involved. Every time we have these forum type sessions, please come out and invite people out, because I think it's important that our community stay educated on the issues that are going on in our communities. So thank you once again.